In today's video, I'm going to share with you 3 considerations for photographing skin with a little bit of texture or wrinkles. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here. I have been a photographer for more than 2 decades, and over that time, I've photographed everything from weddings to commercial campaigns to portrait photography. Now, as a portrait photographer, I've photographed all different types of subjects, different ages, races, different skin colors, and as a portrait photographer, it's extremely important for me to flatter everyone. And that's why today I want to talk about 3 considerations, 3 things I keep in the back of my mind whenever I'm photographing someone with wrinkles. Now, I do want to preface this and say, this is not, here's the formula to photograph wrinkles, because it all depends on intention. So for example, imagine I have someone who's much older, really heavy wrinkles, and I want to emphasize those wrinkles because I want to tell the story that their face has to tell. Like, I want to emphasize that high contrast black and white. Well, if that's my goal of my photographs, then I'm going to choose different directions of light and qualities of light. But let's say I have someone hiring me to do a portrait and they'd like to soften, decrease the attention that the wrinkles are having in the photograph. Well, then I'm going to choose different modifiers and different directions of light. So that's why today I want to talk about these 3 considerations rather than 3 must-have setups. So the 3 things that I keep in mind are quality of light, direction of light, and fill light. If you think of those 2 things, that is going to completely change how wrinkles appear in your images. So with that, we're going to get started with the essentials at the beginning with quality of light. And when I talk about quality of light, typically you're thinking, okay, is it hard light versus soft light? Now, of course, there's everything in between. But the easy thing to remember is that hard light emphasizes texture. So for example, if I step out in the sunlight, step out in direct sunlight in the middle of the day, if I have any wrinkles or blemishes or any texture, all of that gets emphasized by the sun. And that's because the shadow created by the sun, because it's such hard light, is really abrupt. It emphasizes texture. It is going to be instead of being a slow gradient from shadow to highlight, it is an abrupt edge. Now imagine, same thing, I'm outside and the sun goes behind a cloud and everything becomes soft and diffused. That gradient from shadow to highlight, that edge, is much softer. And so what it does is it wraps around the wrinkles and the blemishes, and it's much softer. It emphasizes texture less. So when you come into the studio, you have to make the decision. Do you want hard or soft light? Now, there's a couple of ways to control quality of light in the studio. The first thing is your choice of modifier. So are you picking something that is a hard light modifier or a soft modifier? The next thing is going to be the distance or size of your light. The larger the light source is, the softer the light will be. And the closer that light source is, the softer the light will be. And of course, the opposite is true. So if the light is small or far away, it'll give you harder light. So what I want to do here is I want to demonstrate quality of light, and we're going to pay attention to some of the texture on her skin, and I'll show you before and after so you can compare them. We're going to begin with a hard light modifier. Over here to the left-hand side of the frame, we're going to begin with a magnum reflector and a grid. This is a hard light modifier. It's silver, it's a little bit smaller, and it's going to emphasize texture. Now, by the way, this is not relevant to the texture of her skin, but we do have a light on the background just to give us a little bit of separation and to make a little bit more of a pleasing photograph. But that's not going to affect the quality of light on her skin. So we're going to begin with the single magnum reflector and a grid. It's perfect. All right, so let's look at this first image of Holly. Now, as I zoom in, one of the things you'll notice is if you look at the shadow next to her nose, it is a rather defined edge. That's what you're going to get with a harder light source. But then if we look on the side of her face here, particularly the shadow side, you'll see a little bit more texture underneath the eye and the side of the face. That is what happens when you choose a harder light source. So now what I want to do is I want to go the opposite direction. I want to choose a softer light source. Now, as I mentioned, how I can get a softer light source would be a light source that is larger, that is softer. I could also go for something that is bounced, something that is diffused. So I could do soft boxes, umbrellas with diffusion, any of those. So we're going to go the far opposite direction, and I'm going to choose a large umbrella with diffusion. All right, so we have switched out to a large white umbrella with diffusion, which means it's soft, it's diffused, it's indirect. So let's take a look at the difference. When we look at the image zoomed out a bit, you can already see a pretty big difference. Basically, the main difference you probably notice is contrast. In the original photo with the magnum reflector, you can see that the highlights on the forehead are brighter, the shadows on the side of the face are darker, and so it is emphasizing the difference between highlight and shadow as well as texture. So you'll also be able to flip back and forth, and you're noticing a little bit more dimension everywhere. How about if we zoom in a little bit closer? Let's zoom in to the side of her nose. Remember how I pointed out that shadow before? Now, it is much more diffused. It's a little bit more of a gradual transition. And you'll notice that the textures, the wrinkles on this side of the face, when you compare them to the magnum reflector, they're less defined. There's less contrast. It's a little bit more subtle. There's less attention being drawn to them. So both of these images, because of the quality of light, have a different mood, but definitely the softer choice of modifier is going to draw less attention and less sculpting to those wrinkles. All right, so that is your very first consideration. What quality of light do you want to choose for your photo? Are you trying to emphasize texture or de-emphasize it? Very often with portraits, you are trying to de-emphasize texture, which means you probably want to go for bigger, softer modifiers. My recommendation, maybe a 5-foot octa box, a large umbrella with diffusion, or at minimum, a 3-foot octa box, which is what we're going to use in our next setup for the next consideration. Next up, let's talk about the direction of light. The easy way to put this is the further the light is off to the side or the higher up it is, the more it's going to emphasize texture. It gives more dimension to texture. Now, many photographers, if you actually took photography class, early on in studio lighting, one of the assignments they make photographers do is move a light around an egg. I had to do that. And what it does is it shows you that when the light is centered, there's very little shading, very little dimension to the egg. But when you raise the light up or move it off to the side, you start to see more shadow. Well, in this case, it's not an egg, it's a person's face, and it's the texture of the face. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the light further off to the left-hand side. What it does is it rakes across texture. And so anywhere that there is texture, it's going to create little shadows. And those shadows are going to emphasize that detail. So right now, we have the 3-foot octa box. And again, I still have that same light on the background. There are a couple things you might notice in this photo. First of all, by moving the light further off to the side, you get a more dramatic image. There is more shadows. And so I want to mention that if you're photographing with someone with wrinkles, it doesn't mean you can't move the light further off to the side. You can absolutely create a lower key, more dramatic image. You just have to know the result. So I want you to take a look, for example, at the texture just above the lip or here on the neck. It's going to be emphasized with this position of light. Now let's say I want to de-emphasize that texture. What we're going to do is flatten the light, which means we're going to bring it centered so it's more on axis with camera as well as the face. That's going to reduce the amount of sculpting. All right, so let's move that light. We've moved the light around to be centered on the subject. Now, just a little bit of a gear tip. If you really want to flatten the light and have it straight onto your subject, you may consider a setup like this using somewhat of a C-stand or a mini boom arm. What this allows you to do is center the light without having the stand in the way of your composition. So enough about gear, let's actually talk about the directionality of light on her face, and we take a look now that we have centered that light. When you see this image, you can tell that it is significantly less dramatic. There's a lot fewer shadows. And of course, as we know, shadows are what show texture. So for example, if I look close to the side of her lip and we compare those two shots, in this second image, when we flattened out the light is no longer raking across the skin, and so there's a lot less dimension. It's showing wrinkles less. Same thing as if you're looking at the neck again, there's a lot less dimension to the texture there. Okay, now, I mentioned direction of light left to right, but this also makes a difference up and down. When the light is a little bit lower or flatter onto the face, more even with the camera, it's going to create fewer shadows. But as we raise that light up, it gives more and more and more dimension. As I've mentioned before, there are a couple other things to consider though, because when you raise a light up, that's actually what causes shadows underneath the cheekbones and jawline, which can be really flattering. That's what gives dimension to the face. But when it gives dimension to the face, it also gives dimension to texture on the face. So let me just show you an example when we raise this light up. All right, so when you compare these two images, at a distance, one of the first things I notice is that it actually does emphasize her cheekbones and jawline a little bit more. I think that can be really beautiful. But what I want you to notice is when we zoom in, if we compare these two shots, this photo is the original where the light is lower. Look at the texture underneath the eye. It's much more subtle. Now, when we've raised the light up, you can see we really have carved out, added a little bit darker shadows underneath and besides the eye. So what this actually leads me to is a little bit of a problem solving. What if I actually like the dimension of the face better in this second shot, but I don't really want to show as much texture or wrinkles? What can I do? And so that leads us to our third consideration, which is adding fill light. Adding fill light is going to allow you to keep overall shape to the face, but by filling in the shadows or softening them a little bit, it gives them a little bit less dimension and a little bit less attention in your image. Our third and last consideration is fill light. And there are a few different ways you can add fill light to a scene. First of all, you can use a secondary or third light source to fill in the shadows underneath the face, or you can add bounce reflectors. So I want to demonstrate each one of these and what I think the pros and cons are of each of these choices. All right, so what I want to do is I want to take a standard shot here without the fill light, just to show you where we are starting, and then we'll build the fill light in. All right, so we have begun again with our light centered, and you'll notice that there's still a bit of texture underneath the eyes, a little bit of texture here. And so by adding a light source underneath, what it'll do is it'll fill in those shadows. So the benefit of a strobe is that you can control the output, the amount of fill. So if I really want to go with super glowy, really, really flat, filled in shadows, I can turn this fill light up very strong. But if I just want it to be subtle, I just want to take the edge off the shadows just a little bit, I can turn it down. That is the main benefit of working with a strobe. In this case, the modifier that I've selected is a 1x4 foot strip softbox with a grid. Now, by the way, this is usually my go-to fill. The reason that I choose this is it's small enough that it doesn't get in the way of my photograph. It's wide enough that it fills in around the scene, and by adding a grid, it makes sure that there's not too much light hitting the background. So let's add that fill light and see what we're working with. All right, so what I want you to pay attention to here is if we look a little bit underneath the eye, let's compare those two shots. In the original, there's a little bit of texture, a little bit of dimension. You can see the smile lines, which I think are beautiful. But when we add the fill light, notice how it just takes the edge off a little bit. The shadows aren't quite as dark and quite as defined. Now, which image you like better does of course depend on taste, but the second one with the fill light has a little less texture to the skin. Now let's say I wanted to go even further, even more glowy, fill in the shadows. Well, I can turn the power of this fill light up. So let's go up 3/4 of a stop. Now, which of these two photographs you prefer is personal preference. The second image, of course, though, when you've added the fill, does take the edge, a little bit of the darkness off of the shadows, which de-emphasizes wrinkles. The reason I actually wanted to do this is to show you something to be careful of. Is at times, if your fill light is coming in from below, beneath the subject's chin, and it gets too bright, what ends up happening is that the neck and the chin sometimes can get even brighter than the center of the face. And your eye goes to whatever's brightest, so you end up looking here instead of here. So that is something I want to train your eye to pay attention to and be a little bit cautious of. So if I want more fill, or I want it to be really, really soft, I don't really want to see the fill light, I don't want to see the bright catch lights in the eye or the underlight, but I want it just to kind of fill in the shadows softly, then another choice that I think looks really beautiful would be bounce reflectors. And the same thing is true for the side of the face. If there's shadows on one side of the face that you want to tone down a little bit, perhaps a bounce reflector from the side. Now, if you've watched my videos, you may have seen that periodically I use something called a triflector, which allows you to fill in with different reflectors on both sides of the face and underneath. But something that I usually do for portraits to give me a little bit of a wider shot is I will use white V-flats. So we're going to bring in a white V-flat underneath and to the side. The V-flats we have selected for this setup are by a company called V-Flat World. Now, the reason I like these is because they're portable, they're compact, but for this setup, they're really useful because you can fold them in half and have them act as a large bounce light source from below. And so they're basically acting like a white table or a white reflector. So I still have my light centered, but now we have a white V-flat to one side and another one underneath. I'm going to take a shot to show you how this subtly and softly fills in the shadows for a very flattering quality of light. All right, so I want to take you through a couple of images just so you can see the differences here. Now, where we began with no fill, you can see the shadows underneath her cheekbones and her jawline underneath her neck, as well as the texture of the eyes. But now watch when we've popped in that white bounce fill. It's very subtle, it lifts up those shadows. But look at the difference when we compare to when we had the strong fill light from below. It's a very different look. It's not as subtle. And so typically for a portrait, I really like this bounce look. I think it tends to be just a little smoother, a little more subtle, a little bit more flattering. All right, so there you have it. Those are the 3 considerations for photographing skin with texture or wrinkles. You need to consider your quality of light, your direction of light, as well as your fill light. So what I want to do is I want to make some images for Holly here. And let's just say in this example, I want to go for something that is quite soft with a lot of fill. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch out. We're going to go to a larger modifier, the large umbrella with diffusion that you saw in the first example. And I'm going to put all of these elements together. Of course, what makes the good photograph is not just the direction of light and the quality of light and the fill, but it is also the expression and connection with camera. I'm going to be shooting with the Canon R5 and the Canon RF 24-105 2.0 lens. So for our final setup, we'll have that large umbrella with diffusion, 2 bounce V-flat, and then behind her, the bare strobe on the background for a little bit of a gradient of light. All right, so let's get shooting. As portrait photographers, it's important that we can flatter all of our subjects, regardless of their skin color or their skin texture or how they want to represent themselves. So hopefully you found this video and the 3 considerations useful for your next portrait session. Now, if you want to see the gear that I use to make these images, be sure to check out the links in the description below, and of course, visit Adorama.com. Now, I have so many different tutorials, everything from portraiture to creative lighting to money-making setups that you can check out on learnwithlindsay.com. And of course, if you want more free YouTube videos, be sure to like and subscribe. See you next time, everyone.